All right, folks, it's Bass Action back in action here. In this video, we're going to finish up our examples for solving systems of equations using our row operations and our matrices. You'll notice that I have already set up the augmented matrix. Remember, if you prefer, you are welcome to use that vertical bar. I typically do not. Our goal is on the left-hand side of this bar is to create an identity matrix. We ideally would want ones down this diagonal and all the other values would be zeros. The rows won't have to be in the order to create that. The key is that each column would have 1 0 or 1 1 and 2 zeros, and each row would be the same way. Over here I have given you some steps, an idea of a structure of how to organize your thoughts on these. You will likely, as you work through these, come up with your own pattern, in which case you don't need to really follow mine, all right? But sometimes students have a hard time organizing their thoughts and figuring out where to go on this. So this structure right here will help you. This is not probably the same as what another teacher would use. If you ask 5 teachers, you will probably get 5 different strategies. So this is just one, and if you have a different strategy that works for you, by all means use it. Okay, the first thing that we're going to do, the first step in this process that we're going to ponder is we're going to create a column that has 2 zeros. So what we're going to do on this left-hand side is we're going to scan these columns and we're going to look to see, for starters, do we have a column that has some zeros? If we don't have a column that has any zeros already, we would try to find at least a column that maybe had some ones, because remember, ones can be used most easily to create zeros. We could use other numbers, but ones are going to be the easiest. So on this problem right here, what I notice is that this center column has a 0 in it. So I'm going to focus on this column right here, trying to create an additional 0 in that column. I like to always think about what rows I want to keep the same. So when I'm looking at this, I know for sure that I want to keep the row that has this 0 in it. I'm going to keep this one exactly the same. So I'm going to write that one down immediately to help keep my mind straight on what's going to stay the same and what's going to change. Then the next thing that we want to think about is when I look above this 0, one of these needs to become a 0. It doesn't matter which one I choose to turn into a 0, but I need to change one of them. I'm going to choose to make this one a 0, which means this row will not change. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rewrite that row immediately as well. Again, this just helps us kind of keep track of what we're doing. So the question is how can I create a 0 right here? And I'm going to go back, I'm going to keep saying it. We use ones to create zeros. So if I take row 1 and I add it to row 2, I'll get a 0 right here. So that's what I'm going to do, row 1 plus row 2. And when I do that, I'm going to get a 3, there's the 0 that I wanted, a 2, and a 9. So that takes care of step 1. Step 2 is to create a row now that has 2 zeros in it. And when I'm looking at my rows, I see that this row doesn't have any zeros in it at all, in which case I'm going to leave that row alone completely. I definitely don't want to do anything with that one because it doesn't have any zeros already. What I want to do is look at my 2 rows that currently have a 0 in it, so I'm looking at this one and this one, and thinking that I want to create an additional 0 in one of these rows. Now there's a lot of ways that we can do it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the fact that both of these are 3s, in which case I can either add row 2 to row 3 or row 3 to row 2. It doesn't matter, but I'm going to change one of these into a 0. I'm going to choose to change this one into a 0, which means this row is going to stay the same again. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it again just to help me keep track of what I'm doing. So that one's going to stay the same. Now to create the other 0, I'm going to do a negative times row 3, and I'm going to add that then to my row 2. And when I do that, I'll have a 0, I'll have a 0, a 3, and a 9. Okay. Now, what I now have when I look at this row is I have a 0, a 0, a 3, and a 9. And if I divide this whole row by 3, this will become a 1, which is what I'm looking for, is for these to be zeros and this to be a 1. We could technically rewrite the entire matrix with that step, but I'm going to show you kind of a little cheat that I'm going to let you guys do. And if you want, you can just mark this out, make that a 1, mark this out, make it a 3. Now, if you're going to do this, you've got to make sure that when you're showing your work that you're not trying to scrunch these matrices into a tiny space, or you will definitely start to confuse yourself. Our last step in my process doesn't mean the matrix is going to be done. It just means things are going to be set up really nice for us at this point, is we're going to create another column with 2 zeros, specifically using this row that we created from step 2, meaning I want to use this row to create another column with 2 zeros. So going back to the idea that we use 1s to create zeros, if I'm looking at this row, I can use this one to create a 0 here and a 0 here. That row that I've created the 2 zeros in, that one is not going to change anymore. That one will forever stay the same till the end of the problem. Okay, so now, how can I create a 0 right here using this row? If I do a negative times row 2 and add it to row 1, I will get my 0. So a negative row 2 plus my row 1, that's going to give me then a 1, a 0, and again, I'm doing a negative, so that's going to give me a 3 because I'll have my negative 3 plus my 6. To get my 0 here, using this row 2, I'm just going to add these 2 rows together. So for the bottom row, I'm just going to do row 2 plus row 3. And adding those, I will now have my 3, my 0, and a 3. Now, when I look across this, one of these rows is also now then going to have 2 zeros in it. So this row now has 2 zeros, so I can kind of do my little cheat step again. I divide that row by 3, and I'll get a nice 1, and I get a nice 1. So now 2 of my rows are done, and the only one that's left is this row right here. So when I look at that one, I'm going to use this 1 to get rid of this 1. So I have one more step in this process, and then I can decide that this is done. So rows that are going to stay the same. Remember that middle row is never going to change once you solve it. The bottom row is now complete. I have a 1, a 0, and a 1. And it's only the top row that needs to change. And when I change that one, I'm going to do a negative times row 3, and I'm going to add that to my row 1. And then when I do that, that's going to go ahead and give me a 0, and then a 1, and a 0, and then a negative 1 plus my 3 is a 2. So when I look across this, if I go back and I draw in this vertical bar here in the end, what I can see is that I have in this column I have a 1 and 2 zeros, in this column I have a 1 and 2 zeros, and this column has a 1 and 2 zeros, which means I can now separate out what my variables are. In the top row, I've actually solved for y, so I have y equals 2. In the middle row, I've actually solved for z, and I now have 3. And in the bottom row, I solved for x, and I have 1. We could technically rearrange these rows so all the 1s would be on the diagonal, but I don't really care about that. All I care about is that you can get to those variables, and I end up with a 1, a 2, and a 3 when I write them as their nice triple. Okay, so spend some time pondering these. Remember, the key is that on this step right here, we're going to use that row to create those remaining zeros. Okay, you shouldn't ever have to have a ton of matrices. If you start to end up with 6, 7, 8 matrices and steps, you've probably skipped one of these along the way.